Semafor's Dave Weigel on how guns played in the election and where things go from here. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective. And of course, if you want to get access to exclusive content you will not find anywhere else, hundreds of pieces of analysis and news, you can buy a membership, and that will also go to help support the work that we do as an independent outlet here at The Reload. This week, we are bringing back a guest we had before the election to do a little bit of post-election analysis on what exactly happened in this race. And that is Semafor's Dave Weigel. Welcome back to the show, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, it's good to be back. It was fun last time.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell people a little bit more about yourself for anyone who doesn't know you.
Yeah, I helped start Semafor. I wasn't doing the hard work like setting up people's health insurance and the investors, but I was one of the first reporters here running the Americana newsletter, although I'm about to have a little holiday time off. And I cover politics, mostly from around the country. Just politics has been in D.C. for the last 2 weeks I've been here. But that's always been the goal, is go around the country or pay close attention to things happening and with open eyes, not saying how I guess one of my principles is never saying, "Can you believe this would happen?" Is how could they get away with this? I just assume unexpected things can happen, which is probably a good attitude to take into the confirmation process and the second Trump administration. There are people who I still think look at an alert on their phone and get shocked by stuff, and I do not get shocked by stuff.
Yes, well, that probably is a good perspective to take in with what was going to unfold here. But you're also one of the top reporters, I think, on the national political scene. You break a lot of stories, and I think you have a lot of good sources inside of Capitol Hill, and you know a lot of these things, and you've been doing this for quite a while now. And so I think your perspective is quite valuable, and that's why I'm glad to have you back on the show. Let's start off here with we have a little bit of evidence from the election. You know, obviously we have the outcome, which we can speculate and analyze and which we will do. But it's good to start with some concrete stuff. And I think the best thing we have right now, we have some exit polling that ask people about their top issues, and guns was included in there. But we also just got some polling from Gallup that is kind of interesting. One of the polls they released dealt with support for a handgun ban, and support has fallen back near all-time lows. It's only 20% of the population supports the idea of banning possession of handguns, except for law enforcement. And the particularly interesting thing about the crosstabs in that poll are that Democrats are the ones who drove that support back down. They had actually been the last couple of years trending up in support for a handgun ban, and then to actually almost 50%. It was at 49% for Democrats last year, and this year it dropped significantly by double digits, which drove this support for a handgun ban back down. And I think it's reasonable to look at the campaign and draw some conclusions from that. The poll doesn't specifically ask this, but I think it'd be hard to not notice that the Democratic presidential candidate was running on the fact that she owns a handgun, a Glock, and that probably played some role in this movement, right? What do you think?
I think that's a good insight. So where did that come from? Kamala Harris had run for president in 2019, dropped out of the race, was a very progressive California senator, was even pretty progressive. So this is a thing that got tangled in her story. That was she the most progressive person in California? She ran for Senate. No, she had in ways that affected the campaign, pissed off a lot of activists with how she handled cases in California with You saw this in the primary, that she was too soft on, too hard, I should say, on truancy or on drug crimes, nonviolent drug crimes. And so she runs for president, and she corrects for that by being very, very liberal on crime.
Yeah, in 2020.
In 2019. The 2020 race, but in 2019. And then I heard her talking about the gun she owned, which was never debunked. I believe that she owns one, as a way to cut against that. And they picked Tim Walz, add him to the ticket. He also is a gun owner. He's a shooter. He was in the National Guard. I saw that as a correction of the Harris image that wasn't. That's obviously she didn't win, so nothing sounds successful when you don't win.
Right.
She did decrease. She increased her favorable numbers, and she slightly decreased the number of people who thought she was liberal. But it was more about that. And gun rights, gun safety, as Democrats, I guess the dichotomy now is between, in rhetoric, is gun safety versus gun rights.
Right.
She was a gun safety candidate. She did not talk a ton about it. She didn't add Mark Kelly to the ticket where that would have been his issue. It was much more about the idea that Republicans are adding more danger to people's lives by not keeping the status quo and also not restricting the sale of guns to people with mental illness. And so during the camp, before she's the nominee, Thomas Crooks takes a shot at Trump, and Democrats don't even say in that discourse. Now it's a hard discourse to politicize. They don't even say, "Oh, this assassination attempt proves that what we need to do is make it harder for someone with his profile to buy a gun." That's origin of the handgun legislation in the 80s is the Reagan assassination. So they really rhetorically give up on a lot of progressivism, and it came out of that. It came out of the idea that, all right, people are going to see her as liberal, but we can't let that happen. She needs to emphasize that she's not that liberal. And I did think, I'm not to repeat myself, yeah, the NRA was against her. It just wasn't an issue in the campaign. It wasn't one of the emphases that Trump and Vance made, with the exception of the VP debate when it's memorable because Walz is trying to say he's met with the school shooting victims. He says school shooters.
Right.
But the Trump campaign does get that idea out there that Republicans want to harden schools and make it harder for shooters to get in, possibly let teachers get armed, or no, I wouldn't say require. You know what the issue is there. But no, this was less of an issue. It was kind of a dialed back to 2012, where before Sandy Hook, when Democrats just said, we need to reach people who don't like us on 10 or 12 other issues. We can't do this. We can't talk about guns.
Right. So there's some evidence for what you're getting at here as far as like the issue didn't matter that much. In the two major exit polls that came out, gun policy was an issue, but it was, I think, the 6th or 7th in both of those polls. So it's pretty far down the list. Obviously, the economy being the top issue for most voters in the election. And so yeah, it wasn't necessarily something that, I mean, Trump didn't necessarily emphasize it either. He removed a lot of the gun policy promises from the Republican platform, for instance. But
they removed a lot from the platform, but that was notable. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of what the election might mean for gun policy, down the line here in the next administration, the next Congress. But yeah, I mean, one of the consistent messages that Harris had was basically she didn't not talk about policy at all. She would mention it. She'd say she ran basically on the same platform that Biden did. She had to walk back, for instance, her mandatory buyback support for AR-15s and other types of firearms. But she mainly ran on universal background checks, red flag laws, and ban on the sale of assault weapons. But it wasn't the top issues she was running on. And the main message you really got from her in media appearances or at the debate, for instance, was that she owns a Glock, like she owns a handgun for self-defense. And I think that's where you're seeing probably the movement in this polling. Like, why did Democrats suddenly think it's okay to own handguns? Probably because their presidential candidate kept saying she owns a handgun, right? I
totally believe that, yeah.
And then on the flip side of it, to get at what your, I think, main point there was as well, like, it also, this same exact poll and this one question reveals the kind of baggage she was working against with this message, because Harris had supported a handgun ban as district attorney in San Francisco. She had supported she was the one who put into effect the micro-stamping requirement in California's handgun roster, which effectively banned the sales of new models of handguns in California. So she has this background of restricting handguns. She opposed, for instance, the Heller ruling at the Supreme Court in 2008, which was about, again, handguns. It was about Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban. But nonetheless, she has this record of supporting handgun bans or severe handgun restrictions. And, that's the other thing I think this Gallup poll tells us, which is that that's not popular, right? That's something that's extremely unpopular at this point in time in the United States. And so she had to kind of run away from that and had to try and cover it up. Right? Do you think that's a fair takeaway from both ends of this poll?
Yeah, I think so. It was interesting that I mentioned the debate. I was just trying to get all the stuff that they set out in the campaign in my answer. But this whole campaign operated in a environment where courts with Trump appointees and in the Supreme Court especially just have limited the scope of what you could do if you're a state, especially if you have federal legislation. And that's where all this is happening. It would be ridiculous for Democrats to promise the passage of a bill that they know would be overturned. The action you're going to see over the next couple years, no matter what new appointees are made, is going to be courts hearing challenges to state gun restrictions and overturning them. So I feel like it makes sense in a campaign not to have too much discourse about a thing that they don't think they can change, more than the politics of it, because that is maybe Democrats care a little bit more about this, about making promises in the campaign trail that they can't match. But they do tailor that in. They don't want to be asked, how will you actually do this, and not have an answer.
Right. But it seemed to me like a CYA move, right? Like she's saying she's bringing up her gun ownership because she's trying to cover up for this background of supporting pretty unpopular policies. She did this in a lot of ways, right? She ran away from a lot of the progressive stuff. She kind of, like you mentioned, ran away from it and
didn't explain it. That was I wouldn't say the problem, because it's not clear if that would work, but that's what reporters notice. If you checked if she still supports, because what's her career? She is a senator, and then she runs for president, has a bunch of policies, and then she's Joe Biden's vice president, and they don't achieve a lot of the things that she ran on. So she hasn't promised them in 5 years, but people are still checking with her. But I think in general, as Democrats, they talk less about their record, because even compared to 2019, if you're running in 2019, you still, as a Democrat, have the hope that Ruth Bader Ginsburg lives a little longer and you replace her if you're president. You maybe get a liberal court. All of their ambitions have been tailored. So they talk less about talking less about her record was a theme. But I do think a reason they talk less about their record is just, we can't do this stuff. We're going to work with gun groups. We're going to invite them to the White House. When there's a school shooting, we're not going to say just thoughts and prayers. We're going to say, this is why we need the background check legislation. This is why we need legislation Biden passed, which he talked a lot about. But it was minor. The changes were minor because they can't get much else past originalist scrutiny anymore. Post Heller, post Bruin scrutiny.
Sure. Plus, in addition to that too, that like some of the stuff was pretty unpopular, right? Like the handgun ban. So they didn't want to run on it necessarily. California generally.
California has. It's not her. It is. She's never been. She's attorney general, and she enforced laws, and she had some influence in shaping. But it's been other people running the state. But this is another theme of the campaign, that they're just stuff California has done. Democrats are responsible for, and they did not want to talk about them. They did not want the idea that this was going to be carried nationwide if she won.
Yeah, for sure. I guess just going off of this, we don't have a ton of data. Like, there's not a lot of polling on, hey, did this message influence your vote? Did it work? Did you agree with Harris? You mentioned, she improved her favorabilities, and she had people thinking of her as a liberal a little bit less, or she was able to move some of those numbers. Clearly she moved Democrats on the idea of a handgun ban. But did her strategy work on this policy? Like, did it actually comfort people who, because we've talked about this before, it seemed like her strategy was not really to try and get gun rights activists on board with her campaign, right? I mean, she wanted to keep the gun control activists on board. She didn't really change policy, at least not from where Biden was. She might have walked back a little bit of what she had said in 2019, but they stuck with the same basic policy platform. And but they tried to, it seemed like part of the idea of getting these crossover suburban Republican voters who are uncomfortable with Trump to come on board, or maybe some minority men who become dissatisfied with Democrats. Maybe you can reach them. And part of that is putting forward a more moderate, facade. I don't know what to call it. It's not, because they didn't change policy. She just a more moderate picture of herself on guns. Like, I'm not going to take your guns. I own a gun. Same thing for Tim Mullen. Did that work? Do we have any evidence that it worked? Do we have any, evidence that it didn't work? What is your takeaway on it?
No, not really any evidence that it worked. Again, this context that this just was not, even after the assassination attempt of Trump, this is not an issue that Democrats are forcing. Just in a campaign, you need to have a fight about something. There needs to be you can, when you're earning media, giving speeches or interviews, you have ways to do that. You can fight about something. You can show up at a location, give a speech about it. If you're paying for media, you can run ads, and they just didn't do that. I'm unfamiliar with any ads that I tried to look for them all. Any ads they ran about this issue. They just. What would her presidency have been like? It would have been like the Biden presidency, where they're appointing judges who are skeptics of the recent precedent, and they would have, again, it would have been more about blocking than about achieving things, and that's not very exciting. That's not a very. This was an overall theme of her campaign, is that she tried to run on some smaller, achievable ideas and pick some small fights, but she didn't want to get into a topic if she didn't have a good answer. And for example, the answer on where she differed with Biden, she didn't want to get sucked into that. She was the theme of all this is that she was a very cautious candidate with a cautious campaign, perhaps overcorrecting for how she ran in 2020. I'm not trying to dodge your question. I'm just thinking, looking back at what I covered, and I was reviewing it before this, there wasn't a moment where an issue is forced and they said, well, here's an opportunity to draw the huge contrast on guns between me and Trump. That's just not how they approached it, because they were so worried about putting out fires on other things, which she was seen as left wing. Right.
No, I think that's very accurate. Even on guns, she talked about owning a gun, but it was mostly, like I said, mostly a COIA thing. Like, she's not as liberal as you think. She's not as radical as Trump is saying. That was sort of the message, more than drawing, like a very stark contrast on policy or anything like that. And although, and I do think it is difficult to kind of drill down onto this one issue that voters said was not one of their top issues, and try and figure out, did this messaging actually work? We can kind of guess at who she was trying to appeal to. And certainly it didn't work well enough to win, because she lost. Maybe it worked to some degree. The swing states were closer as far as the non-swing states swung more to Trump than the swing states did. So her campaign seemed to have some impact, but not enough impact to win. I don't know. But how can you say anything more specific than that? I don't know.
No, and you could look at the vote in Uvalde, Texas. Just Trump did better than he did 4 years ago there. So there wasn't any place where this was a salient issue where she improved. I wrote about this right after the election, that the turnout is going to end up being, I think, total turnout for everybody, 1.5-2 million less than 2020, which is considerable when you consider how much states that had expanded easy mail voting rolled it back. Not all of them. California didn't, but other places. And she ran behind Biden. He ran ahead of himself. but she did much worse in safe states. I was just talking to the chair of the Minnesota Democrats who's running for DNC chair, and I was pointing at me, not to shame him. I was just noting these are states that are next to each other, and Minnesota was very proud of its turnout record. It usually said it. And she got 50,000 fewer votes in Minnesota than 4 years ago. And he got, and she got 37,000 more in Wisconsin. And different situations. Yeah. Minnesota, Tim Walz's Minnesota is a place where Democrats had a trifecta and they actually could pass a lot of progressive bills. And yeah, they lost a little bit of ground in legislative elections. But people were less, when they were not pouring money into turnout and voter targeting, they were doing worse. And Trump was basically doing the same. There's not, I need to go run the math. I didn't see a state where he got fewer votes than he got in 2020. And I saw 43 where she did.
Right. Yeah. But at the same time, the places where she was close, did better were the swing states where she was focused her campaign. So that it seemed to have some effect, not enough of an effect to hold back the swing towards Trump, or maybe even more accurately, a swing away from Biden. It's just one of those things that it's hard to zero that down onto like, oh, well, did she do better in Pennsylvania than, as far as the shift in vote goes, than in Minnesota because of her gun messaging? I don't know that you can say that.
It was notable that Walz didn't help the ticket there. That she did better than Hillary Clinton, but worse than Joe Biden. And trends of the last 10 years did not decelerate in the state. For example, Vance didn't seem to help a lot either. I mean, Ohio was slight improvement, but Walz's can't argue with it. Well, they did a little bit worse in Walz's state. They did, and Trump did a little bit better in Vance's state. There wasn't much of a mandate for, we like what Governor Tim Walz has been doing, we want to expand it nationwide. Yeah,
or at least like that his approval in the state translated to votes for the presidential ticket, right? But so, I do think like this is one of those areas where like the easy thing would be to be like, well, she lost, so clearly her message didn't work at all. Or Trump's message on guns was clearly superior, and that's why you want. And there's not a lot of evidence for this stuff. In fact, the most evidence we have, at least from the exit polling, is just that it wasn't a top issue, and so it probably didn't affect significantly the trajectory of how the race came out. Speaking of which, shifting gears from Harris to Trump now, Trump won, right? But again, this was not a top issue in the race. He didn't really emphasize it all that much himself, but he's made some promises to gun rights voters, right? What should people expect to see from a Trump administration? Do you think it's something he's going to actually be focused on as president? I will say a lot of his promises when he spoke to the NRA in February, for instance, were focused on undoing things that Biden had done.
Yeah.
Do you think he's just going to stick with that? Or
there was great pressure on me to have to do something with guns, and we did nothing. That was his. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, that is the agenda. And if you look at what he ran on, because he actually ran on a very comprehensive agenda before the RNC platform came out. He had pages for everything he was going to do. But look, he campaigned in New York, and he didn't say we're going to get rid of concealed carry restrictions in your state. He didn't emphasize it. And that's where I go back to the courts. Not too much, because it's not that interesting to talk about. They exist. They're not being changed politically by one election in one weekend. But yeah, it's more about you're not going to who is going to be at the room and who's not going to be in the room. You're not going to have Giffords and Moms Demand Action in the room after a shooting or when something is being debated. You have a Republican House and Senate. They're not going to pick this up. Is there a possibility that Democrats run on some of this in 2026 in House races? I think there is. But in terms of his White House, they're not saying here's the stuff that we're going to do for gun owners in states, in Republican-led states. Just everything is moving in one direction. This has been true since Sandy Hook. A trend that a lot of us wrote about was since that shooting, since you saw the return of gun legislation, I would say, not that it ever stopped. You saw Democrats saying, all right, we're going to pick up this third rail again. Gun laws have been more liberalized across more of the country than not. There are blue states that pass restrictions. Some of them struck down in court. There are red states that loosen restrictions. They haven't been struck down. So it's fairly savvy for the NRA audience to listen to Trump and be satisfied with that. There's not a lot else that they need to ask.
Yeah. So, in your view, you think and you're right, he has kind of presented himself more as a shield, I guess, than a sword.
Absolutely.
In this
good way to put it.
circumstance. So he's more about not adding new restrictions, although he, of course, did add new restrictions when he was president previously with the bump stock ban.
Which has been thrown out by court, so he didn't really have to answer for
it. Which was found unconstitutional by his own Supreme Court appointments. But, he does seem to have this desire to undo what Biden has done, though. Like, I think that's probably fair to expect, but maybe not go beyond that and try to do the pro-gun version of what Biden has been doing with executive orders. What do you think? So
he could. The thing about the executive orders is that he's not detailed some of what he's going to do. His emphasis, remember I'd be a dictator, but only on day one comment, which I thought at the time was stupid for Democrats to focus on. I think that was correct, because clearly what he meant was Biden had, and he said this, Biden did executive orders on immigration that I can reverse, and if that's dictatorship and whatever. He didn't say what he would do on guns, and there are, because of the attention on Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, not just them, but it was conservative groups under the umbrella of the Heritage Foundation saying, here's our plan for another Republican presidency. There are ideas there that, again, start with undoing Biden executive orders. But the details are a little thinner because of the way that Trump was talking about them, the negative stories being written about them. I wouldn't say negative. That's unfair. The fact that there was this window, people were talking to them, and then they realized Democrats were attacking conservatives with the material from articles about Project 2025. The Heritage Foundation has been working on executive orders, but they won't tell you what they are. And I think as a reporter, I'll probably get some back channel information about what to expect, how it looks. But they wanted to not have this be an issue in the campaign. So we're not entirely sure what he'd do, what has been vetted, because these are written, and they have to kind of be written in real time. There are, let's say you write something in June, and then a decision comes down the Fifth Circuit, and it would be moot. You have to rewrite it, and you have to consider new information. But there will be executive orders on guns. They're mostly going to be anything that that Biden put on the desk. We're going to take it off. We don't know what the additions would be. Yeah,
right. Or if he's going to prioritize doing anything beyond trying to get rid of what Biden has done. Because getting rid of what Biden has done is not, a simple day one thing necessarily. Some of it is. The Office of Gun Violence Prevention is just a random office that Biden made up. He just created. Mm-hmm. So Trump can undo
that,
it if
for
he wants
example.
To, or
yeah.
whatever.
I mean, pro-life activists want to take his pro-choice post-Dobbs task force and turn that into a pro-life task force. Sure. And I've heard more about let's get rid of this task force. I've not heard let's turn it into a gun rights task office. I think there might be some pressure to do that, but I haven't seen it. I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, we'll see what he ends up doing with it. Firing the ATF director that Biden appointed is another one that he could do immediately if he.
And there were calls during the campaign to just get rid of the ATF, but he didn't endorse that. There definitely are people who want Jaws administration who want to get rid of it.
And I think that would likely require legislation to do that.
Yeah,
I think Project 2025, the only real gun stuff in there is to move ATF back under Treasury. So instead of Justice Department, I don't know if that's something he can do administratively or not. But regardless, I think he has made in public at that NRA speech promises to undo Biden's acts. Some of them will take longer, like undoing the federal rules that the ATF put in place. You have to go through the whole rulemaking process again. Some of them he's probably not going to be able to grasp at, like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It's unlikely he's going to be able to repeal that because that would take legislation, and it would also take a lot of Republicans reversing their position from when they voted for it. the first time. So just an unlikely thing to happen. He can probably have, he can change maybe how some of the funding is allocated from that bill. But regardless, but yeah, there's just a lack of really proposals to do more going in the other direction. But doesn't mean he won't, but it wasn't something he did in the first administration. And he didn't go out and make a bunch of pro-gun executive orders. He did very occasionally. He would do something like withdraw from the UN arms trade agreement that got a lot of criticism from gun rights. He actually did that in a very theatrical way. He did it at the NRA annual meeting one year. He brought the thing out on the stage and he signed it. And so maybe he'll do something like that in the future. I guess we'll have to see, but it doesn't feel like a high priority, right?
Not really. Not one of the things they're mentioning, not one of the things they need to live on, because so much of the premises of what Trump needs to do that he ran on are things Biden screwed up that he has to fix. And this is not top of list. Yeah.
Yeah. So beyond Trump, obviously we have anything that would be extremely significant change to federal gun policy would likely have to go through Congress, and we will have a new Republican Congress. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm interested in your thoughts there on what do you foresee any significant gun policy gun legislation making it through this upcoming Congress, given, the margins at play?
No, so Republicans say they don't want to get rid of the filibuster, which in theory they could do if 51 Republicans or 50 and the vice president just say we're holding a vote, we're changing the rules. Democrats did that with judicial nominees. They did it with Supreme Court nominees. You could do that. That's a judicial and cabinet, which I don't want to get on a tangent whether that was a good idea. I generally think it was. The status quo of anyone being blocked by 41 votes was not great for either party over the long run. They have not done that with legislation, and because so much of what you want to do on guns, you can do in court. You can just find the right court, sue to overturn a law, find a right to constitutional carry, etc. This would not be the one that Republicans change the filibuster over. There's just not the demand. I've not even seen the demand from the NRA or other pressure groups to do it. I've not seen a do constitutional carry as part of this. Even concealed carry reciprocity, I can see that being added to something. But think of it, two parts to this. One,
do you really think you could get some sort of national reciprocity as part of a broader package?
I only think that because there was an effort to do this 15 years ago when Obama was president, and Tom Coburn was trying to make it happen. I think the politics have changed. I just know that there was a time when you could get Democrats on board. But that's what I was getting. That's what I was getting to, is that think of who the Democrats are. And so they've got a pretty strong House minority. It's, I think, going to be the largest House minority in we keep setting records, the largest in like 100 years.
It's going to be wild.
And none of them feel pressured on gun legislation. Kind of Marie Perez, I said none of them, now I name people. I would say
it's maybe like five.
Liberally five people feel like they might be pressured if they vote on the wrong way in a gun bill. And the House will do a lot of messaging legislation, which will test them. It always does. What Democrats in the Senate would feel pressured to vote for something? I don't think any, because John Ossoff is the one Democrat in cycle in Georgia who holds what's technically a Trump state, a state that's moved to the left since 2016, a little bit to the right since 2020. But the reason Democrats are, one, the state has very liberal gun laws, and there's no sign of that changing. Two, Democrats, they're competitive, or they win because they win in Metro Atlanta, they win in the college towns, they hold on to the black belt. He's not cross-pressured the way that a conservative Democrat or a Democrat like Mark Pryor or Blanche Lincoln, the Democrats who all lost in the Obama years. Yeah. Even this time, like John Tester's gone, John Tester's gone, Joe Manchin's gone. You just don't have anyone who's going to feel like they have to vote for this. So if there is no change the filibuster, they bring up a Senate bill. I don't think you get any Democrats on most gun legislation because what would be the point? And if you're Ossoff, you need to keep. Now there's some changing relationships between Democrats and the pressure groups, not the gun groups. They have a very good relationship with Mom's Demand, with Giffords. I don't think they're inclined to cross them before an election. And again, it wouldn't. You look at the math. Like, does it help you in Gwinnett and DeKalb County to do that? Probably not. So that is a difference where you had 10 years ago, 8 years ago, enough Democrats where you could try to pull some in the Senate or make a problem for them. And you just don't have that anymore.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. There's just not that same level of blue dog Democrat type out there anymore. That could vote for some of this stuff. Someone is knocking on my door as I'm recording.
Oh.
It's fun times. Just going to ignore them and hopefully they will go away. That's how I handle all my problems. But yeah, no, it's certainly something where I could. I think that legislation is just not really possible. But maybe there's some compromise. Or what do you think of reconciliation? This is another area that people often bring up as kind of a way to get things through.
Yeah,
that can't get to 60 votes. What something like, for instance, reclassifying suppressors or silencers, taking it out of the National Firearms Act, which is a tax technically. Like if you remove the tax stamp, the tax requirement from them, that maybe you can stretch that as a budgetary bill and get somewhere with that. I don't know. Like, do you think that kind of thing is? Because again, reconciliation only requires 51 votes, right? It's sort of the workaround to the filibuster that has existed for a long time, but there's a lot of rules to how you do it. Do you think there's some space there?
Yeah, the way that would be done, you mentioned what they could try to add, because reconciliation, you get 2 runs at that every Congress, two appropriations bills. Sorry. 2 funding bills that are only need 50 votes to pass. And that is where you put everything. That's where Democrats try to put in minimum wage increase, immigration reform. The way and immigration reform, every time what you need to do is argue to the parliamentarian that this is germane because it affects the federal finances. This will raise revenue. This will decrease revenue. So you could come up with a rationale and say to the parliamentarian, this piece of gun legislation that we're adding to this package has a fiscal effect. Therefore, it's germane. Leave it in. The parliamentarian in 2021 knocked out what Democrats wanted to do. They did not contest it. The Biden position was, I won't contest it. Trump has not been super interested. So Trump has been odd about this because he's called for the end of the filibuster on and off when he's not getting his way, and then he's given up on it. And he's never really gotten in the weeds on the Senate parliamentarian. But what Republicans could do, and they did under George W. Bush, is get a ruling they don't like, an unfavorable ruling, and just say, all right, there's a new parliamentarian now. We're putting somebody in who we think is going to rule our way. It's easy to imagine Trump wanting that for one of his priorities. I don't know if this would be the priority, but that's how it would happen. Is we're trying, step 1, we have an idea, please approve it. Step 2, you didn't approve it, we're going to get rid of you. That would be the steps before they try to do anything with the vote threshold on all legislation.
Right. Because, I mean, you could make an argument that literally anything is budget related or will have some impact on the budget, right? But it's all about what the parliamentarian allows. And then it's a fight over, like you said, then it's a fight over the parliamentarian themselves, if you want to take it that far. But generally speaking, Senate Republicans haven't traditionally been as willing to use those kind of tactics as Donald Trump.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Maybe
and John Thune is, and John Thune is the leader, and he's attitudinally exactly like Mitch McConnell on this. Rick Scott was running for leader, and Rick Scott wasn't even fighting on this. His complaints about how the party moved were more just there were priorities that could pass that McConnell would never put on the calendar. But yeah, this is not leadership that's inclined to do that.
Okay, interesting. So I guess the last bit then is maybe the most impactful, right? We talked about this with Brez last week from Punch Bowl, but it's probably going to be the judicial appointments, right? I mean, do you see any reason that there won't be 4 straight years of Trump judicial appointments and just getting what he wants, because you're probably going to have Republican control of the Senate for that entire time, right? Just glancing at the 2026 map, doesn't seem like a lot of pickup opportunities there for Democrats.
Yeah, the caution is that Republicans had 55 seats in 2004 and they lost 6 in 2026, so it's possible.
Yeah, it is possible. It just depends on the politics, how things.
Yeah, and even this time, I'm not just the conversation and sort of the news judgment around covering Senate races. It was very clear that when Joe Manchin retired, that Republicans were going to get 50 seats at least. And it was very clear when John Tester was not leading in any poll that Republicans were probably going to win the Senate. But reporters were pretty cautious about saying that and covering the kind of outside bets that Democrats were making of, can we put Texas in play, which they couldn't. Can we put Nebraska in play? Couldn't, although that was actually closer in Texas. Could we try Florida? That wasn't at all. So there'll be a special election in Ohio. There'll be a special election in Florida to replace Marco Rubio, in Ohio to replace J.D. Vance. And to briefly to deal with this, there is a shot that Democrats, they could win Maine, they could win a special election in Ohio if Sherrod Brown comes back. They could win North Carolina. They could maybe win Alaska if Mary Peltola runs. So I don't think until we know the candidates in a year will you say impossible. But you're right, more likely. Point. I mean, like it's more likely than not that they have it. And this happened in the Trump years. It was actually they had 52. They had a Senate majority when Trump took office. They lost a seat in Alabama. They regained that, not that Alabama seat until 2020, but they held that majority, and with a very narrow majority, they could pass lots of people. They were only losing judges if they just seemed incompetent. And this what would happen there was in just hubris, where they wanted some young conservative judge without very much experience, or a conservative attorney without much experience on the bench. They'd have a hearing and they'd be humiliated because they didn't know anything. Not to be too mean to them, but this is sort of the John Kennedy style in Judiciary Committee meetings, is quiz them on not basics, but also somewhat obscure law to see if they know what they're talking about. So they only lost nominees if they were terrible. And so, yeah, I think you're basically right. I just say that Democrats are looking at this map, and had it been a 55 seat, really, but for 30,000 votes in Wisconsin and 30,000 votes in Nevada, they could say, "Oh, we're done for a decade," and they're just on the cusp. I think they might with a really good election. Let's imagine, not because it's good, but imagine for the scenario a situation where just the economy actually does decline. There's some sort of crash. There are unpopular cuts. All of a sudden, he's polling at 25%. That's the scenario where Democrats say, all right, we're going to make a run at these things.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that Trump could ever poll at 25%, but you could certainly see him getting much less popular.
But less popular, and with a coalition, because this is a big factor. Not to just I'm trying not to take us too much off the topic to the pure electoral stuff. But this is a thing that makes Democrats more confident about the midterms. And not that the word I would not use to describe Democrats now is confident. But a thing that makes them think we could have a great midterm, we could gain, the House is not as good as done, but we could gain it, is because Trump has activated so many voters who don't usually vote. Republicans are going to spend 2 years trying to convince people who never voted until 2020 to come back to vote in the midterms for people who are not Donald Trump. That might be tough. Whereas Democrats are going to rely on this coalition of college-educated voters. Not that they all have college-educated, but their coalition now is like college-educated liberals, college-educated moderates, 85% of black voters, 55% of Latino voters. And that's been pretty effective in midterms. This is a reason why Democrats had the disadvantage 20 years ago. They have an advantage now.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I will say, like, if you look back at the early Obama years, for instance, even after that what is probably the closest thing we're getting to a landslide presidential election in our lifetimes. Although I guess I was born in '87, so you might have been around for the last Reagan landslide. But even after that, even after Democrats had 60 votes, Scott Brown won in Massachusetts of all place as a Republican. So, if people the country can turn pretty quickly in these scenarios, and you might see some surprise wins depending on how things go over the next 2 years. But that'll all be, again, I guess, depending on how things go over the next 2 years. There are some of these structural aspects to the coalitions that can point you in a certain direction, or you can look at the map and not see really amazing pickup opportunities for obvious pickup. It was pretty clear, like you said, that this time around, Republicans were probably going to win the Senate either way, however this election came out. But you don't necessarily see that in 2026, but you do, like you said, there are reasons to think maybe the Senate doesn't stay Republican through all 4 years. But I would still say, on the whole, more likely than not, that Trump is able to push through a lot of judges that will favor gun rights, and that will probably be the most substantial part of his upcoming administration, just like it was the most substantial part of his previous administration on this stuff, right?
Yeah, certainly in the near term. I was talking about the midterms just because it's interesting, but
sure.
In the near term, in the next 2 years, that'll be the priority. If they have a bad, at this point, 2 years, November 2026, if they manage to lose the Senate's just gonna John Thune's gonna open it up and confirm everyone to an opening they can possibly do. The one thing I haven't heard, which I haven't heard anyone do because it would require 60 votes, it would require filibuster reform, is there's the occasional discussion about expanding the number of judges, period. Just saying, well, the country's going more complicated, or we should split the Ninth Circuit and add another circuit. I haven't heard that at all. I don't think they would do that in this circumstance because they're just going to have enough openings. The difference between them and coming in, I wouldn't say ironic, it's the wrong way to put it. A difference between them and the last time that Trump was coming in to replace a Democrat is because Obama didn't have the Senate for the last 2 years of his term. And just McConnell strategically, obviously famously with Garland, but strategically kept a ton of seats open. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett got a seat that had been kept open for years. Just they would not let Obama fill it. And that is as we talk right now. It's the main goal of Democrats is filling every seat they can so Trump can't do it. I think they're leaving a few where they do not have a nominee that can get to the floor. This is not. They do take this seriously. This is occasionally somebody online is like will fantasize, but is finding some 22-year-old Georgetown law student, making him a judge. They do need to vet them. There is a process for this, but they're not going to leave a lot of empty space for Trump. It's going to be more conservatives who retire, take senior status, and people who die. That's a very important point, because that's not something we've talked about yet on the show. Is like there won't be as many opportunities for Trump to appoint judges this time around as there were the first time. Immediately. Yeah. So good point. But all right. Well, hey, we appreciate you joining us again and giving us your post-election view, like you did with the pre-election view. I think a lot of good, insightful stuff in there. If people want to read more of your reporting, where can they do that? They can read it at semafor.com. I write Americana. It comes out once a week for now. It was twice a week before the election. I think it'll bump up back to twice a week later, but no offense to Virginia, New Jersey. I don't have 2 stories a week about Virginia, New Jersey elections. But actually, I am going to be covering more. At Semafor generally, I have the newsletter every week, but I'm writing more when I see a story, write it, things, and writing more about policy, because I enjoy covering campaigns, but this conversation is a good example. When you get power, you do interesting things with it. And so once people are in place, I mean, there are parts of this I've been covering for years. People said we have a plan, we can implement it if we just win the presidency and the Congress. Semafor is going to have all that. I post on X as Dave Weigel. I post on Blue Sky as Dave Weigel, and I don't hate Blue Sky. People have opinions about it. I'm having fun there. I am blocked by maybe 1,000 people because they think I'm too conservative.
It is definitely it does skew left for sure. Not as much as it did early on, where people, my gosh, I know people talk about it as an echo chamber now, but early on. That
Much
place was
worse.
wild. But
Yeah.
it is much closer to your sort of old school Twitter than X is. It's just a lot less algorithmically driven, and and then all the Elon stuff obviously isn't a factor on Blue Sky. But I think the more interesting thing about it is it's basically just what Twitter was in how you find people, how things get into your feed. Threads has been fine, but everything's an algorithm now, and I don't want that. I want to follow people I trust and see what they're saying and what they're retweeting, and that's what I like about Blue Sky so far. Anyway, I still post all our stories on X and Threads, and I'll try to go where people are, but yeah. I follow you on, I think, all of them too. So we have 3 different ways of keeping up to date with one another. So that's always fun. I'll have to find an app where you can actually cross post across. I haven't tried to do that.
I've not tried. I'm pretty strategic these days about what I post, because I do try to put it. If I got news, I put it on our website where people can click through to it. But there's so much stuff. One thing I did this week was I was just at a meeting of Democrats, and I quoted one thing, and that blew up, and I didn't write a story till Friday. So it's still worth following me on those things. I try to, if I get information, I put it there. Yeah,
sometimes it's not worth a full story, or you don't have the bandwidth to write it immediately or whatever. You want to still get it out there. They're still useful for that, for sure. And then also, complaining about sports or trying to buy a car. I was just complaining about that on social media. So if people want to hear those thoughts, go there instead of the podcast. But all right. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and we'll have to have you back on in the future as well.
Yeah. Awesome to do it. Thanks for having me.
All right. That's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.